back shortly.
In a lonely mansion shrouded in fog, a mother lives with her two children who cannot bear the touch of sunlight. But when strange noises echo through the halls, doors lock by themselves, and shadows linger where no one should be, she realizes something terrifying is inside the house. As the truth unravels, the boundary between the living and the dead shatters in a chilling revelation that no one saw coming. In this video, I will recap a 2001 horror mystery film titled The Others. Without further delay, let us delve into the storyline. The film is set in 1945, shortly after World War II, in an isolated manor located on the Channel Islands, New Jersey. The narrative begins with a strict and meticulous woman named Grace, who awakens from a disturbing nightmare and prepares for her day. Her morning routine is interrupted by the arrival of 3 visitors at her door. Before the older woman can explain their purpose, Grace invites them inside without hesitation. Grace treats the newcomers as potential servants and instructs them to introduce themselves. The group consists of Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and a young woman named Lydia, who is mute. Having recently placed an advertisement seeking new staff, Grace assumes they are there for employment and proceeds to give them a tour of the manor. During the tour, she expresses relief that the previous servant had vanished the week prior without notice or compensation. However, as they enter the kitchen, she locks the door behind them and subsequently secures the music room as well. In this space, she outlines the key rules of the household. Firstly, no door may be opened unless the preceding door is closed. Secondly, Grace emphasizes the importance of silence during their tasks, as she suffers from migraines and values tranquility in her home. She also informs them that the house lacks electricity due to interruptions during the war, which forced them to adapt to living without it. Grace then decides to introduce her children but instructs the servants to close all curtains first. This leads to the implementation of her third rule. Her children and Nicholas are medically sensitive to sunlight. Exposure can cause their skin to blister within minutes. Consequently, it is essential that the environment remains dark when they are present. Afterward, the servants begin their duties, with Mrs. Mills preparing breakfast for the children. During this time, Anne mentions that their mother has become unstable since their father, Charles, went off to war and never returned. Grace overhears this conversation and discreetly advises Mrs. Mills to disregard her children's comments. Moreover, Grace realizes that her advertisement for new servants was never collected by the mailman, prompting her to question how Mrs. Mills learned about the job opening. The new servant explains that she happened to be in search of work because she previously worked for the manor's former owners. Grace then cautions her about her children's peculiar and imaginative notions, which she does not endorse as she prefers a more grounded perspective. Later that day, Grace engages her children in a Bible study focused on moral conduct and the consequences of wrongdoing in the afterlife. She instructs them to study separately for better concentration and escorts and to another room. While the children study, Grace remains in the living room until she is interrupted by the sound of a child crying. In a state of panic, she rushes to check on Nicholas, only to discover that he is simply relaxing. As the cries continue, she assumes they are coming from Anne and hurries to her room, only to find that Anne is not crying either. However, unlike Nicholas, Anne mentions that she too heard the cries and recalls meeting a boy named Victor who had just left the room. According to Anne, Victor was upset because he dislikes the house and urged them to leave. She also brings up Victor's father and others who have been observing the property. Grace finds this account implausible, questioning how someone could enter and exit the house with the door locked. She is then taken aback to see that the door across from her is ajar. Furious, she summons the servants and reprimands them for the situation, but they insist they have not been inside the house during this time. Later that night, while the children are asleep, Anne wakes Nicholas, who panics upon noticing that the curtain is open. Anne reassures him that she did not open it. It was Victor. This revelation frightens Nicholas, prompting him to curl back into bed as Anne closes the curtain again. Subsequently, and can be heard arguing with a boy who tells them to get off his bed, which terrifies Nicholas further. She then encourages Victor to touch Nicholas's cheeks to prove his existence. Upon hearing Nicholas scream, Grace rushes to their room and finds a frightened Nicholas, who blames Anne for his distress. In response, she punishes Anne by making her read in the hallway while admonishing her to stop frightening her brother, and maintains that she is not fabricating anything. Frustrated by her daughter's ghostly tales, Grace insists that Anne read from the Bible until she apologizes to Nicholas. 3 days pass without an apology from Anne, who claims she cannot apologize for something she did not do. Meanwhile, Grace attempts to embroider in silence downstairs when she hears a loud disturbance from upstairs. She calls for her other servant, Lydia, to quiet down but realizes upon looking out the window that both Lydia and Mrs. Mills are actually outside in the yard. Perplexed, she ascends the stairs to investigate further, while Anne reveals that Victor and his family are present in the junk room upstairs. Cautiously entering the room, Grace begins to hear whispers among what seems like several individuals. Alarmed, she uncovers furniture in search of them but finds no one. Suddenly, a door swings open, prompting her to rush out in pursuit of the intruders, but they are nowhere to be seen, and asserts that multiple intruders are moving about the house and claiming it as their own. Later that day, Anne shows Grace a drawing depicting all the occupants of the house: a father, mother, a little boy, and a frightening old woman who beckons Anne to join her. Convinced that there are indeed intruders in the house, Grace arms herself with a rifle and instructs her 3 servants to open all the curtains and conduct a thorough search of the premises. After their search yields no results, Grace retreats to the junk room alone, where she discovers an old family photograph alongside several post-mortem images. Given Mrs. Mills's previous employment at the manor, Grace decides to inquire about these pictures. Mrs. Mills explains calmly that post-mortem photography was a common practice in earlier times. Grace finds this morbid and requests that Mrs. Mills dispose of the images. That night, Grace embraces her sleeping daughter and apologizes for her strictness. However, little Nicholas remains awake and asks when their father will return home. This question reignites Grace's grief over her husband Charles's likely death, and she spends much of the night in tears. Suddenly, she hears piano music emanating from downstairs. Taking up her weapon, she prepares to investigate. As Grace enters the room, the sound abruptly ceases. Overcome with paranoia, she locks the piano and exits, only to be confronted by the door slamming shut in her face, effectively locking her out of the piano room. This incident causes her to panic and call for Mrs. Mills. Upon opening the door, Grace is taken aback to find the piano illuminated and open once again. Mrs. Mills attempts to soothe her, explaining that the realms of the living and the dead can sometimes intertwine, a notion that Grace struggles to accept. Beginning to confront the possibility of ghosts inhabiting the house, she resolves to seek out the local priest. Despite Mrs. Mills' efforts to dissuade her, Grace remains resolute. On her way out, she instructs the gardener, Mr. Tuttle, to search for gravestones on the property. However, after she departs, Tuttle expresses concern about her safety, to which Mrs. Mills responds that the fog will prevent her from straying too far. In a further display of suspicion, Mrs. Mills instructs Tuttle to completely conceal any gravestones he may find. Meanwhile, the fog in the woods thickens to such an extent that it obstructs Grace's path. Amidst this haze, a figure emerges, startling Grace. It is her long-lost husband, Charles. They embrace tenderly, causing Grace to forget her initial mission to find the priest. She then brings Charles home, much to Mrs. Mills' astonishment. The first thing Charles does is approach his children and hold them close, but soon after, he retreats to the bedroom and lies down for the remainder of the day, appearing visibly unwell. Later, as Grace shares a meal with her children, she seems unwilling to acknowledge the existence of ghosts and reprimands Anne once again for believing in them. This upsets Anne, who runs out of the room in tears until Mrs. Mills intervenes, reassuring her that she has indeed seen the intruders and has been discussing them. Furthermore, she hints at significant changes that are on the horizon. At this point, Grace begins to entertain the idea that all the intruders have returned to their former residence, which raises concerns for Mrs. Mills and others. They believe that Grace will be particularly challenging to convince, complicating their plans. The following day, Grace dresses and in a veil she has been sewing, which Anne adores so much that she wishes to keep wearing it. Afterward, Grace leaves her alone to attend to her husband, who remains in bed looking lifeless. When Grace returns to check on Anne, she finds her playing on the floor. However, to her shock, Anne's hands and face appear aged. This sight provokes a violent reaction from Grace as she lashes out in anger. In her haste to remove the veil, she realizes she has been handling it roughly all along. Mrs. Mills arrives promptly and takes Anne away. Later, she provides Grace with her usual migraine medication and advises her to relinquish some responsibilities. However, Grace becomes skeptical of Mrs. Mills' intentions. Once Mills departs, she discards the pills into the sink instead of taking them. Upon returning to the bedroom, Charles confronts Grace about an incident during his absence where she allegedly became violent with their children. He expresses his disappointment in her actions while Grace insists that she loves her children and would never harm them. Nevertheless, Charles then rises and declares that he has come home only to say goodbye, as he must return to the front lines. This revelation infuriates Grace. Understandably, she wishes for him to remain by her side. He approaches her and kisses her in an attempt to calm her down but vanishes by the following morning. Grieving deeply, Grace makes her way to the front gate in hopes of catching up with him, only to find that he is no longer there. Simultaneously, the children awaken to daylight, and upon realizing their surroundings, Anne lets out a loud scream. Hearing her distress, Grace hurriedly rushes to their aid, only to discover that all the curtains have been removed. In a state of panic, she wraps her children in a coat and leads them to the only remaining dark room in the house. Grace then confronts the servants about the situation, but they appear unusually calm and suggest that the children may have simply outgrown their photosensitivity. This response infuriates Grace, prompting her to retrieve a gun just as Mrs. Mills and the other servants arrive, further heightening her fear. She aims the weapon at the three servants to thwart any potential plans they may have. Taking the keys to the rooms from them, Grace discharges the firearm when they attempt to pacify her. As the three servants exit, Mrs. Mills informs her colleagues that it is time to reveal the gravestones. Meanwhile, Grace dedicates her day to searching the house for the missing curtains but is unable to locate them. That night, Anne again attempts to convey to Nicholas that their mother has reverted to her previous madness and violence, reminiscent of that fateful day. However, Nicholas remains skeptical. Growing bored, Anne decides to leap from the window in search of their father, prompting Nicholas to join her out of fear of being left alone. The two children venture into the darkness and soon encounter three gravestones. Concurrently, Grace continues her search for the curtains and ultimately rummages through the servants' quarters, where she uncovers a shocking truth. To her horror, Grace discovers a post-mortem photograph of Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and Lydia. Simultaneously, Anne realizes that the gravestones belong to the three servants, revealing their ghostly nature. Just then, the servants appear and begin approaching Anne and Nicholas. Frightened, the siblings flee and eventually reunite with Grace. She instructs them to hurry inside while attempting to shoot at the apparitions without success. Mrs. Mills informs Grace that the three individuals succumbed to tuberculosis over half a century ago. In response to this revelation, Grace retreats into the house and locks the door as the three servants approach. She demands that the deceased leave them in peace before telling her children to go upstairs and hide. Mrs. Mills explains that they must learn to coexist with each other, the living and the dead. However, Grace refuses to accept this notion and insists that if they are indeed dead, they should allow her family to live in tranquility. The servants counter that even if they were to leave, intruders would still inhabit the house. Tuttle adds that it was these intruders who removed the curtains. Meanwhile, the children are concealed within the wardrobe when an elderly woman unexpectedly opens it, prompting a startled scream from them. Mrs. Mills informs Grace that the intruders have discovered the children, and she must now speak with them upstairs. Despite her fear, Grace ascends to check on Anne and Nicholas, where she encounters both the intruders and her children. The elderly woman inquires of and about the events that transpired earlier, but Nicholas cautions her not to disclose anything. The scene reveals the blind woman writing on a piece of paper while two men observe their interaction, accompanied by a husband and wife. The old woman again asks Anne what their mother did to them, specifically mentioning something about a pillow. The children and Grace react with shock at this revelation, while the old woman questions why they remain in the house if they are deceased, which leads them to vehemently assert that they are not dead. Grace becomes agitated and begins to create a disturbance in an effort to convince them otherwise. At this moment, the perspective shifts to reveal that the group at the table is conducting a séance, indicating who the true spirits in the house are. The individuals gathered, consisting of paranormal mediums and the actual owners of the house, begin to discuss the recent occurrences. The wife expresses her frustration with the haunting and advocates for moving out, referencing the troubling history of previous owners. She recounts that a prior occupant descended into madness and ultimately strangled and shot her own children. Additionally, she mentions that their son, Victor, has been experiencing nightmares and sightings of a little girl in the house. This revelation prompts the husband to concede, promising that they will vacate the premises first thing in the morning. Just outside the room, Grace comes to the realization that she has been dead all along. Memories flood back of how she killed her children before taking her own life out of guilt. Ultimately, Grace accepts her status as a ghost, and Mrs. Mills enters to welcome her, informing Grace that for now, the intruders are departing. However, she warns that others will inevitably come in the future, and they must learn to coexist peacefully. With their acceptance of their ghostly existence, the children venture outside into the sunlight for the first time, discovering that it no longer harms them. The film concludes with Grace and her children observing as the intruders pack their belongings and prepare to put the property up for sale. Thanks for watching. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe for more of these recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.